Right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Alistair Shawn. I am one of the senior economists here at Infometrics. Oh, Brad says I'm going to stand behind the lectern. Welcome to the launch of Infometrics Export Market Finder. Obviously, we know that exports have become a key element of New Zealand's economic recovery over the past year from COVID, and a key element of the resilience of our various regions. And we see that firsthand from all the regional clients that we work with. Just a couple of facts that Brad and I pulled out very quickly. In February 21, New Zealand's exports to China increased by $369 million over February 2020. And the prices of our exports are going up as well. BNZ's commodity price index was up 4% in March of 2020 over March of 2021 over March of 2020. Our journey with Export Market Finder started well before COVID, but the events of the past year have really reinforced the potential importance and the need for this. And just before I hand over to Gareth, our chief forecaster, who will be taking us through the findings of our research that we've done into exports from Te Tauihu, I'd just like to acknowledge our partners, Nelson Tasman Chamber of Commerce. Ali's not here, but thank you, Ali, and Port Nelson Export Hub. I'm not sure if Hugh's here yet, but thank you to Port Nelson Export Hub. Also, our clients here in Te Tauihu, NRDA and Marlborough District Council, thank you very much to you. I'm not sure who's on Zoom. I did see Mayor Leggett from Marlborough was registered on Zoom. If Mayor Leggett is online, welcome to him. Welcome to Mayor King, who's here in person, so thank you very much. I did get an apology from Mayor Rees as well. And lastly, our partner in Export Market Finder from Trade Advisory in South Africa, Martin Cameron, is supposed to be online as well. So thank you to Martin and welcome to him. And with that, I will hand over to Gareth. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alistair. Just bear with me a moment. I just need to share my screen with the people who are zooming in as well, and then we should be good to go. Excellent. Thanks, Alistair, and thank you all for coming down this afternoon, taking time out of what I'm sure is your busy schedules to come and hear about the report that we've been working on over the last month or two, and the findings from that. Before I get underway, also, I just want to give a chance for my colleagues to not introduce themselves in any formal fashion, but maybe just give a bit of a wave. We've got about, I think, 8 people here from Infometrics. Feel free to, if you guys could just have a bit of a wave, mostly hiding down the back. Thanks, guys. We're free for a chat afterwards, certainly in terms of some of the more in-depth stuff as well, which I won't get to go through in the presentation, and more about how Export Market Finder can potentially be useful for your business or organisation. As Alistair said, exports massively important to the New Zealand economy, and probably never more so given the upheaval we've been through economically over the last 12 months or so. Let's have a look at just how they've been going in this part of the country, though. And Brad did tell me that would happen. There we go. A graph here for you of Te Tauihu's exports over the last decade or so. You can see certainly since 2014, 2015, been really good growth coming through there. Between 2015 and now, up by about 4.2% year on year, or year in, year out, so 4.2% every year. That figure includes both, that's 9% for this part of the country, 4.2% for New Zealand as a whole. So Nelson and Marlborough really running ahead of how well the rest of the country is going in terms of exports, and New Zealand has been doing pretty well as a whole there. Within those exports from this part of the country, if we look at wine, for example, we know that wine exports have skyrocketed during that period. Some of that is price growth, but a lot of that is also volume growth. If we look over the last 12 years, basically wine exports have tripled. You must say, what's going on with 2020 there? Well, COVID is one of the reasons there, but while wine has kept growing through the last year, we have seen a bit of a drop off in export values for seafood, wood products, logs, horticultural products. So quite across the board there, but as Alistair said, the latest data we're getting through, particularly in terms of prices, but also volumes, is looking promising as we head into the early stages of 2021, that there is strong demand and activity happening out there. That's at a high level. Why are exports good though? Well, if you're in business, of course, if you're able to grow your export market, you'll have more revenue, creates jobs for the region and boosts incomes within the region as well. And from an economic point of view, boosts overall GDP activity, GDP growth coming through. Growth is good, but it's not the be all and end all. And we know increasingly there's a more consideration or greater consideration being given to other factors which may impact on the ability of exports to grow overall. And certainly with New Zealand's agricultural base, that couldn't be more true as we look more closely at things such as freshwater quality, and also climate change and the effects that carbon emissions are having. So growth is not necessarily the be all and end all, but it is part of the picture. Another part of the picture though, and certainly something that comes through from the work that we've done in terms of looking at potential export markets out there, is diversity. And by diversifying your export markets, you can potentially become more resilient in terms of your business, in terms of your region as well. And so that's very much one of the themes that I'm wanting to put through to you today. On that diversity note, this graph here just shows you how much of concentration there is for New Zealand's exports and how that's changed over the last 12 years or so, how important China has become. You look back to 2008, you can see roughly 5 to 6% of New Zealand's exports went to China. We signed the free trade agreement, came into effect at the end of 2008. And since that time, you can see that China has been taking more and more of our exports through that period, to the point where it's now hitting 30% of our total exports heading to China. Now, if you've ever studied economics in New Zealand, you'll be well familiar with some of the risks around diversification. One of the examples which was hammered into me when I was younger studying economics was around the UK. And you go back, New Zealand, of course, was a colony of the UK and very much reliant on sending our butter and our wool and our meat to Britain in the early days of our trade. But even by 1972, we were still sending 31% of our exports to the UK. The next year, the UK joined the European Economic Community, and very quickly we were shut out, or largely shut out of that market. And there were other things that happened during that time as well, the oil price shocks and that sort of thing. But it had a massive impact on the New Zealand economy, and it took us a long time to recover from that and to switch our export markets to find other areas where we could send our product. This figure that you see here for China is the largest proportion that a single market has taken up of New Zealand's exports since that 1972 sort of landmark year. So the risks are there. Another example, a more current one, obviously, would be around what we've seen with Australia and their trading relationship with China over the last year or so. There's obviously been sort of political tensions between the two countries that's seen tariffs have been imposed by China on many export products coming out of Australia and heading to China: seafood, wine, timber as well. All of those are pretty relevant exports for this part of the country, for Te Tauihu. And barley would be another example as well, of where Australia has been scrambling to try and find new export markets because of some pretty large tariffs that have been put in place. Now, we know that New Zealand is not necessarily immune to those sort of political tensions that have arisen between Australia and China. They haven't really affected us at this stage. But even if we put those aside, we know that China is pursuing a policy of trying to be more self-reliant than they have been in the past. And so it's not just a political tension story there. There is measures in place to try and actually grow their own wine production and protect their own wine market as well. So in that space, Australia has found themselves exposed, but potentially New Zealand could as well in other product categories too. So that diversity, really important, and that's one of the sort of key messages I wanted to get across as we look through some of the potential markets that we've explored and uncovered with our analysis. Before I get into the specifics of those markets, I just want to give you a bit more background on how we've gone about the process. And Export Market Finder is a very data-driven product, a lot of data-driven analysis in there, basically looking at all the trade flows that happen around the world between all the countries and saying, well, where and across all the products. So you can imagine, you multiply all those numbers up, there's a heck of a lot of information in there. Historically, when you think about how how sort of new markets or potential markets have been identified, a lot of the time it tends to rely on anecdote or people's personal experience, or looking at historical trends and going, well, we've achieved good growth in this country, perhaps we can achieve further growth from here. And that may be true, but it might also not be true. And so what we're trying to do is bring a different perspective to things and say, let's bring a bit of data, a bit of rigor and analysis to the numbers that will help supplement the expertise that businesses have in their individual products and in their individual markets. I certainly know from writing the report and thinking about specific commodities and export categories that you quickly find that you're not an expert in wine by any stretch of the imagination, despite how much I might like to drink it. And so there's a whole lot of nuances through the wine market or the timber market or whatever that I, as an economist, as a generalist, don't necessarily know about. We're not trying to sort of say that we're experts in those regards, but what we are trying to do is bring sort of rigor and analysis of data and bring it to the fore so that we can then say, well, here's some markets you might not have thought about. Try and uncover some unusual suspects, as well as potentially ruling out other ones where you might think you've got potential for growth. But in fact, when we delve more deeply into the numbers and into the trends around those markets, there may not be much more scope for growth. I'll give you some details, obviously, around specific markets a little bit later. So Export Market Finder, I've gone through, I guess, a lot of the aspects of what is behind it. How can it help you as a business or as a region? There's probably two fundamental questions that it helps you to answer. One is if you're a business making a specific product or category of products, you're currently exporting, or you might not even be exporting, and you go, well, I want to grow my export markets, or want to find new places to export to. Where should I be targeting my efforts to make sure that I'm getting the best bang for buck in terms of my returns there? From a regional point of view, and this is very much the focus of the report that we're releasing today, it's looking at, well, what are the exports that Te Tauihu is strong in already? We know that wine is one of those, for example, and we know a lot of that goes to the US or the UK. Where else may we be, should we be looking at potentially trying to send that? And so looking where, as a region, the best investment in terms of potential for growth could be, whether it's by industry or indeed looking at specific markets about where you can send that product as well. I don't want to get deeply into the methodology of how Export Market Finder works because it's really technical, and it would probably, your eyes would be glazing over pretty darn quickly. But basically, look, there's 180 odd countries out there. 5,000 products within the database as well. And what we do is we start off and identify all the countries that New Zealand, all the countries that import the product that we may have in question, and look at where New Zealand might be underrepresented in terms of those imports going into a specific country. Of course, not all countries are created equal, and you may not want to try exporting a product to, I don't know, Nigeria, for example, because we don't have the trade linkages there in place, the transport and logistic linkages. There may be other African countries which you would say, yes, we're underrepresented in terms of their imports, but they're not politically stable. They might be commercially risky as well. And so those get filtered out through a process, filter out the areas, the countries where there's not actually a great deal of demand for the product, or where their demand is declining. So you might be able to get in there, but you're wasting your time because your ability to sell into that market is going to shrink over time. Filter out the countries where there's high tariffs in place, which are obviously going to be a major barrier to our products getting in there, or where the shipping costs might be overly expensive as well. So you can see through that filtering process, there's a whole lot of countries which won't make the cut because there's various reasons why you probably shouldn't consider them for this particular product in the first place. Once you've got those countries and filtered those out, you're left with a more select pool of countries, and those get ranked in terms of what is the potential value of exports that we could grow into those markets for product in question. The methodology is recognised by the World Trade Organization, and basically Export Market Finder, it's been developed over the last 20 years at a university, Northwest University in South Africa. And there's a whole lot of PhDs and master's research that's gone into developing that over time. And from there, it's been commercialised into what we're working with today across a number of countries within South Africa and other countries. Queensland would be another example, in Australia, where they've taken it on board as well. And so Infometrics has invested in the development of it from a New Zealand point of view, because you can imagine that every country, it's a slightly different kettle of fish in terms of what you're exporting and where you should potentially export that to. So we've invested in that to bring the product to New Zealand and look to identify and grow the export markets that are potentially out there for New Zealand and Te Tauihu. So let's turn to Nelson Marlborough and just look at the categories that we've got in the report here, 8 broad export categories. Now this graph here, what we've put up here is 2 parts to it. The orange part is what this region is currently exporting in terms of the value. So you can see with wine, for example, roughly $2 billion of wine exports coming out of this part of the country. And then we look through the, this is for New Zealand overall, actually, I should say. The total exports are around about 2 billion. You can see through the other categories as well, seafood and aquaculture, wood products, logs, apples and kiwi fruit, all major export earners for Te Tauihu. We put in meat and dairy, not because it's necessarily an area that Nelson and Marlborough are particularly strong in. Certainly they don't make up as much as of the overall export basket for this part of the country as they do other regions, or many other regions, but they are still actually quite important in terms of the overall value of exports that is occurring. So we've got those in there, and then we've got a selected other food category, and I'll pick up 1 or 2 examples of that later in the presentation. So the orange is what our current exports are from New Zealand overall across these export categories. The blue part is the additional potential that we've estimated across each of the categories that you see there. And you may, I think, when the invitations went out for the event today, I think there was a bit of a teaser in terms of a $24 billion number, which was put out there to say this is how much we could potentially grow exports across the categories that we're looking at. That $24 billion number, let's be realistic about it though. In terms of most of these being horticulturally based, as I said earlier, we can't simply go and grow our meat and dairy exports to meet these numbers, because we do have increasing environmental considerations to take into account. So rather than necessarily saying this is a realistic number that we can grow the exports to, it is about saying, well, what if something happened within the dairy market and suddenly there was less demand from the people we're currently, or the countries we're currently exporting to? What room for diversification is there? What other markets are out there that may be willing to take our product as well? If you look through the numbers overall, look, wine obviously has a lot of potential to grow. Seafood, aquaculture, wood products as well, quite a lot in there. What's interesting is if you look at logs, not a lot more potential there. And we know over the last 10 to 15 years, China has been taking massive amounts of our logs increasingly. It used to be a lot of our log exports went to Japan and Korea. They still take quite a bit, but nowhere near as much as China is taking. And that's really grown there. What it means is, though, there's not a lot more growth there. And you take those 2 bars together, it's quite interesting that maybe the sort of focus within that forestry industry does need to move back towards some of the more value-add stuff or value-add products to build resilience over the medium term. Because if China suddenly turned around tomorrow and said, we don't want your logs anymore, there would be significant problems within the industry because of the lack of diversification that has occurred. Meat and dairy, as I said, not major parts of the Nelson Tasman economy or Nelson Marlborough economy either, but there is still only relatively limited growth given the overall size, or potential growth given the overall size of those markets. So I want to delve in now and have a bit of a closer look at just some of the products and categories that we've highlighted in the report. There's a lot more detail in there. Certainly don't have time to go through all of it. I just want to pick out some of the more interesting highlights from that. And we'll start with the wine market. Now, generally speaking, New Zealand doesn't lack for overseas markets in terms of our wine, where we make our wine and pretty much able to sell it all. And certainly that export picture that I showed you earlier around and how much wine exports have grown over the last 12 years or so, quite a phenomenal performance there, both in terms of prices and volumes. So possibly the challenge for the wine industry now is, yes, how much more can we grow, but also what is the sort of mix of exporting that we should be doing? And, you know, in particular, sort of equation around bottled wine versus bulk wine. What we've seen over the last 15 years or so is that bulk wine has gone from a very small percentage of wine exports to now sitting at close to 20% of our wine exports. So it has lifted substantially. And that does reflect some of the logistics and transport issues that mean getting the wine out of Marlborough and overseas, especially if you're going to the likes of the UK market, can be relatively expensive. Therefore, moving it in bulk can be a potentially more cost-effective option, even if you're not getting the quite the same high price at the end. Let's look at the bottled wine first, and you can see our major export markets at the moment: US, UK, and Canada, the three largest ones coming through on this graph. What is interesting, I've talked a lot about, or mentioned a lot about diversification, is that in terms of bottled wine, what we're seeing is still the largest potential for growth is actually, generally speaking, in our more established markets already. Now you might say, well, you're going against the diversification argument a little bit there, and I am. But the reality is that if you look at the US and the UK, New Zealand is only supplying around about 8% of their total wine imports across each of those two markets. So we're not saturating the market, those two markets. There is still room for growth before we start to get ourselves too heavily exposed across there. If you look at the numbers across all of the potential wine markets, roughly $4.8 billion of potential export opportunities for New Zealand. And we know that, of course, Marlborough is producing around about 3/4 of the wine that does get made in New Zealand and then exported as well. If we look at the US, you can see from roughly 500 million to potentially $1.4 billion of exports. UK up from about 300 million to around about 800 million. So there is significant growth in that bottled wine space, notwithstanding, of course, those transport and logistics costs that can be something of a constraint, but in our view, still a lot of potential there. We look at bulk wine, less scope for growth. We look through the numbers there. We see possibly around about $600 million of potential growth across the markets. You can see that the UK and the US are taking a large chunk of our exports currently. So it again is those two markets. If you're looking for a diversification option here, interestingly, Germany looks like quite a good possibility, though the risk around some of the European countries, and this certainly comes through when you look across many other export categories, is the question of how much of an imposition the import tariffs that Europe has in place are. Europe tends to be quite protectionist in terms of their trade policies. There's a 12% tariff in place currently, or roughly a 12% tariff in place to Germany for our bulk wine imports. It's different on in the bottled space. But you can see even with that 12% tariff in place, we've still got a reasonable chunk of those bulk wine imports going to Germany. So in our view, it's not a binding constraint. It's not something that's going to completely prevent that growth occurring. And when we look at the other markets coming through, you don't see them on the graph there, but there's a number of other European countries where there is potential for growth in our analysis: Sweden, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands being some of the ones that came out. The UK, also an interesting one to note, of course, with them having exited the EU. This analysis has been based on the fact that there was the same tariff in place in terms of those bulk wine imports going into the UK. So in terms of free trade negotiations, whether it's with the EU or with the UK as well, certainly that's where an area of significant gains could be made. And so look for further, if we do see progress there, I'd look for further growth in those bulk wine exports, particularly to the UK. Having a look at salmon, this is one of the most interesting findings actually, was looking at salmon weather and the mix of our exports across fresh and frozen fish. If we look at our current exports of salmon, I don't have a graph of the mix, but most of our salmon is currently exported fresh. And our analysis suggested that actually, while there was a little bit of scope for growth on top of that, there was not a great deal. Whereas when we looked at frozen salmon, where not much of our exports are sent overseas frozen comparatively, I think it's in the order of 10 to 15% off the top of my head, that's where the real scope for growth potentially lies. So you can see in terms of what is currently sent overseas, it's mostly going to the US, a little bit to Canada. In terms of how much more additional potential we could send, though, masses there. And if we look at that number for the US, it's roughly $170 million of potential that we've estimated in the frozen salmon market. That's more than New Zealand's total salmon exports over the last year. So there's huge potential for a sort of change in what we're doing in that space. You might say, well, we're better sending fresh, we get a higher price for it, and that may well be true. But remember, there is also, that's short-term returns, but there is also the question of resilience, diversification over the medium term. And by diversifying, you're not necessarily going to switch everything to sending frozen salmon to the US. That wouldn't be realistic. But it does show there is room for changing the mix of what we are exporting and where to as well. Interesting. I mean, it did amaze me that the US came out. It surprised me because I would have thought US, what are they going to be eating? Canadian salmon? As it turns out, the major export markets for frozen salmon going into the US, China, Norway, and Chile. Now, so none of those strikes me as being ones that should, have a particularly close affinity with the US, any more so than we should. So it does suggest there is scope to be getting in there. Now, the other question you may have, of course, is around, well, how can we suddenly go and produce a whole lot more salmon? You've got major resource constraints or limitations, and there's questions about how much salmon farming can continue to grow in the Marlborough Sounds, for example. We recognise those issues, and as I said earlier, part of the story is around diversification, but also bearing in mind, government has an aquaculture strategy in place where they want to achieve $3 billion in annual export sales by 2035. We're well short of that figure at the moment. I don't have it off. Do you know the figure off the top of your head, Alistair? $1 billion, isn't it? Yeah, so we'd have to triple it over the next 15 years. So if you are aiming for that, this is one of the pathways to potentially be doing it, as long as you can overcome those sort of production constraints. Let's turn to timber, and I talked about the mix of logs and value-added or slightly more value-added timber products earlier. I just want to focus on one specific timber product, and that's plywood. We've talked a bit about MDF and also one category of sawn timber in the report. But I just want to look at plywood here for you. And what is interesting is when we look at the exports, both coming out of Nelson and New Zealand, roughly 25% of New Zealand's plywood exports, or for the main category, leave Nelson. And they basically go to Australia and Japan. And you can see that's reflected in the nationwide exports that we've got on the graph here as well. So focused on two markets very much. If you're a bit worried about diversification, you could say, well, okay, we could grow more in Japan, we could grow more in Australia, there's potential there. But look at the USA. Now, for those of you who are familiar with it, there will be some small import tariffs or restrictions on New Zealand on product going into the USA. But our view is probably not sufficiently large, it would seem to us, to limit that growth to any great degree. There's a little bit of product going to the US at the moment, but gee, it looks to us like there's potential for a whole lot more that could be sent there. Canada, sticking with that North American theme, Canada also comes through, nowhere near the same potential, but there are no tariffs in place there, so there's certainly that free access. And then a little closer to home, certainly no further away than Japan, Thailand as well comes through. Again, not as much potential, but you're still talking a $12 million potential export market in our view for sending product to Thailand as well. lots of nuances in timber, and certainly that's one of the areas that I will fully profess to not entirely understanding all the ins and outs of, but certainly potential growth across various markets there. Turning to the dairy sector, I don't want to talk about the boring old stuff of milk powder and cheese and butter. There is discussion of some of those in the report. What I want to focus on, though, quite interesting, is ice cream. Partly because we do actually see a bit of ice cream production and export coming out of Nelson currently. Last year, $4 million of ice cream was exported from the Nelson, Tasman and Marlborough region, with that primarily going to Japan. If we look at New Zealand's overall exports of ice cream, the other major markets apart from Japan are China, Australia and Tonga coming through in the export stats. Our analysis when we did the numbers suggested that Europe might be a potential market for ice cream exports going forward. You'll recall earlier when I was talking about how we ruled out countries that tariffs were one of the factors that we put in, that come through in the analysis. Now, we looked at the tariff figure for Europe and it comes right back at around about 17% for imports of ice cream. And we looked at that and said, well, okay, it's not large enough for it to be ruled out by the export market finder, by the analysis and the program, the work that it does. But I felt a little uncomfortable myself saying, well, maybe that's still too big for New Zealand to be able to overcome. There was certainly not a lot of evidence when we looked through the existing export stats that New Zealand currently exports to Europe. So I was like, well, maybe let's just leave that one alone. Looking outside of Europe, though, you can see a range of countries coming through. We currently export to China. There's possibly room for a bit more ice cream to go there. One of the interesting themes that came through with some of the countries you see here, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia would be another one, and not on the graph, but Kuwait is probably, I think, in the next one or two down in terms of potential markets. A number of Muslim countries where potential for ice cream exports was reasonably good. One of the sort of tools or settings in Export Market Finder that is there is to question how much of the exports will be able to go forward if your product is not halal. And so it became very clear very quickly, looking at those countries that I mentioned, that if you're not manufacturing the ice cream to halal standards, then you're not going to be able to get into the likes of Saudi Arabia or to a great degree Malaysia either. So it may be, and again, this is a sort of an area for further investigation and discussion with those who know better or more detail about the markets, how much sort of change of your recipes or production techniques do you need? I had a bit of a read around ice cream being halal, and I think mainly it relates to the inclusion of gelatin in the ice cream as a sort of a thickener, I believe. So, is the investment needed to change your recipes and production techniques sufficient to mean that the payoffs that you get from starting to investigate some of these other markets are going to make sure that that's worth your while? So interesting questions coming through there. The final product I want to look at, one I'm sure that's dear to many Nelsonians' hearts, and certainly something I like to eat a fair bit of as well, is peanut butter. And again, interesting with peanut butter because there's massive potential when you look at some of the numbers out there. But again, trade barriers in Europe mean that of the sort of estimated 200 odd million of export potential that would be out there, the tariffs in place in Europe are pretty much prohibitive, we think, in terms of getting peanut butter in there at any reasonable price. But there are still several other countries, and we've profiled a few here where the tariffs are reasonably low or not at all there. So what is currently quite a small export product, $3 million leaving Nelson last year, and that's roughly a quarter of total peanut butter exports. So we're talking $12 million nationwide. You can see there's potential to almost double that by sending product to Saudi Arabia alone. Now you might say, well, PIX is quite a specific sort of, not niche, I don't want to use that word probably, but certainly at the top end of the market, and it's not necessarily what everyone's going to buy. And I'd say, yeah, okay, agreed, that may be the case. But it also means that if you're looking at some of these markets, such as Saudi Arabia or Switzerland, for example, you might have relatively high transport costs getting your peanut butter halfway around the world, but it does mean if it's a higher value product in the first place, that the proportion of your final total cost that you're able to sell it in those markets is not going to be as much transport costs, and people are probably going to be less price sensitive as well. So again, there's a fair chunk of issues to be thinking through there, but certainly food for thought around where peanut butter may well go to from here. Now, as I said earlier, can't go through everything in great detail because there's a heck of a lot more in the report in terms of product categories and under each of those that I've talked about. So encourage you to go and read that report. I think there is do we have handouts? Yeah, we've got handouts which has a link on it. It should also be relatively easily found on our website as well. But yeah, that's basically what I want to take you through. Final point is, look, if you do want to know more about Export Market Finder as well, feel free to get in touch with any of us, particularly Alistair. It's his baby, and he will be able to, give you more detail, more understanding of how we may be able to help you in terms of either your business or your organisation as well, in terms of exploring some of those potential markets that may be out there. For now, though, happy to take questions in terms of anything I've gone through or anything you feel I've glossed over far too quickly. Yeah.
Could you go back to one of your slides, perhaps the peanut butter one?
Sure.
What is the number crunching that you've done to estimate that in Saudi there's a $10 million market opportunity?
Great question, and I have another slide prepared especially for you. Bear with me a moment while I get that up properly. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick high-level summary of how the maths behind it works. So I think that's what you're asking. So let's, rather than look at peanut butter to Saudi Arabia, let's talk about apples to Saudi Arabia, because that's the one I've got here. So what you can see on this graph firstly is this is exports. The most recent data we've got for the whole world is 2019. We have newer data from New Zealand, but for the world it's 2019. And these top 6 bars that you see here are the 6 largest exporters of apples to Saudi Arabia. Okay, you can see New Zealand's position relative. It's not the next one on the list. We've just put New Zealand there. You can see very little. And then the rest of the apple imports going into Saudi Arabia is roughly $35 million. So you can see that these ones, especially Italy and Chile, they make up quite a big proportion of the overall total. If Saudi Arabia passes all our filters in terms of tariffs and all that other stuff I talked about, then what we do, basically what it says is, okay, generally speaking, the top 6 exporters are where you want to be, realistically, somewhere in that pool. You're not going to be Italy for whatever reason. I don't know why. You might get there eventually. But let's just say you want to be somewhere in the middle of that pool. The average of those top 6 exporters in terms of sending apples to Saudi Arabia is roughly $36 million. New Zealand currently exports 0.9 million. If we were to get to the average of the top 6, it would be another 35.2. The maths is a rounding error in there, but it'd be another $35 million roughly to get to the middle of that top 6. And that the analysis and the research that's been done would suggest that once you've gone through all those filters, getting into the top 6 is a realistic goal. Like I said, getting up to be number 1 to everywhere is far from realistic. Does that help answer your question?
Okay, so can you run on another filter? In this case, dollars per case, dollars per ton of apples.
That's
Because maybe we're doing very well in the top 1% of the market.
yes, that's where the nuances start to get more complicated. That's certainly, I want to say, beyond the scope of Export Market Finder. That's where I think the dialogue come between us as the sort of the big data guys, as it were, and you as a business who understands your market. You could come back to us and say, Saudi Arabia, complete waste of time because of this and this and this. That's great. for us, it's probably about turning it around a little bit differently. And if you said to us, we could also have the same dialogue with you. And if you said to us, well, I think I should be exporting to Vietnam, I'm picking a random country, I don't know. But, and we could say, well, the reasons you shouldn't be exporting to Vietnam are they're not growing their demand for apples, or they've got this, probably know about tariffs, so I'm not going to pick on tariffs, or all their apples come from China and you're going to struggle to get into that market because it's already dominated by China. But no, look, a valuable question around the dollars per case. And certainly, I'll give you one more example. Certainly writing the report, we were discussing mussels, and I was looking at the Aquaculture New Zealand data and going, okay, so we export fresh mussels and we export frozen mussels, and people get more for frozen mussels than they do for fresh. It didn't make any sense to me. And we went and talked with Aquaculture New Zealand, they said it's because of all the wastage that goes on along the way that you get paid a lower price at the start. Obviously, the price that it gets sold for at the end, because of all that spoilage, is way higher. But as the exporter, you don't see all that money. So, yeah, it's those type of nuances that we're not necessarily experts in, but we certainly would love to talk about that, and delve into that more deeply with individuals, businesses and organisations. Yes.
Am I correct in thinking that the blue possible future sales, is that based on how you said it's average here for the front? Is that based on taking sales from others, being beating down your competitor basically, as opposed to finding brand new markets that aren't out there at the moment?
That will be part of it, and let's be honest, I suppose in some senses it will be a large part of it, but remember I did also say that we are looking at areas that are growing in the first place. If a market is shrinking or static, it's probably going to be ruled out as one that you should be bothering to try and get into. So yes, part of it is taking market share from others, but part of it will also be, if the market is growing, you could potentially get up to that 36 million in this example, if you were taking all of the growth over a few years. And I mean, it's an extreme example, and it's probably not going to happen. So it's probably a mix overall. But I think put it this way: if you're not look, with commodities, with sort of low value, I don't want to say low value, but stuff where there's not a lot of value add going on, you're in a very very competitive market where the price is what the price is. Whereas when you get into some of the value add, higher value add things, then that's where you do have the ability to also differentiate yourself in terms of various aspects of the quality of the product, or aspects of the product. So that's a way that you can potentially sort of grow the market overall without necessarily having to just try and compete and knock everybody else down on something like price. Yeah, go for it.
We're at about 25% of the actual forest, but 25% of the probable.
Yes. Yep.
Can I ask, I'm interested in this,
right.
Can I ask how you can see a 75% growth with our industry is based on quotas that we're capturing, and as an industry, we're on a heavy knockbacks from stock shorting, stock this, if anything, we're getting more areas we can't fish in.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you pose that 75% extra growth?
Yeah, no, a very good question. And what I should have said when I talked about salmon too is that I purposely talked about salmon because, look, we talk about hoki in the report as an area where maybe you could diversify sending the hoki from wherever, Australia or wherever, to different countries, but there's no way you can grow it because you've got those quotas in place. Whereas in the aquaculture space, notwithstanding the resource consent issues and some of those environmental issues, there is actually potentially more room for actual growth. But yeah, it is, look, the 25-75 that you talk about there with seafood and aquaculture overall, it's very much demand. What is the potential demand out there in the world for this product or this category of products? It's not saying you could tomorrow go and grow your exports, or at any time over the next however long, you could grow your exports to meet that number. Basically what it's saying though is there are other potential markets out there, and if you're thinking about diversification, or you know, if you're thinking about it ahead of time, or if it needs to happen for whatever reason, then there is scope there as well. So yeah, it depends what product and industry you're looking at, and certainly for seafood, I recognise what you're saying there. Yeah.
Once a year.
Yeah, yep, comes through once a year. So we've just had the latest update through in terms of the 2019 trade flows. I know that sounds a little bit old, but it does take some time to come through. But yeah, that's how often it is. Yes. Yeah, not on me, but Andrew, actually, I wonder maybe you should talk to that, because we've been doing some work trying to estimate sort of the exports on a regional basis, and it's obviously you've got a limited number of ports around New Zealand of where product leaves from, and we've been trying to map that back to what region it probably comes from. It's not a perfect science, obviously, because I mean, even with dairy, for example, we've got some figures in the report, and we know that dairy production in Nelson, for example, I think it's 1.5% of the total country number, but only 0.6% leaves out of Port Nelson. But yeah, I think we do have estimates of what the sort of export potential, the export numbers are on a individual Tasman or Nelson or Marlborough. Nearly forgot which one it was, across each of those individual regions. I think we can go down to local authority level, can't we? Yeah, so regional local authority level, we've got estimates.
Just over half, and then Nelson's the smallest, and that's mainly seafood. Yeah, so it's kind of hard because there's no raw data of this comes from this region. Yeah, like I wrote it down and yeah. Well, we try to take that into account. So we look at the district's GDP and sort of their employment, so how big the industry is in that district. And then we also look at where those exports leave the country. So say like a lot of the wine actually leaves out of Nelson Port, so that's going to boost the wine exports around that area. But of course, some of it is going to go out of Auckland, where a lot of it's bottled as well. And that's where it is still it is a model, and it won't be perfect, but if those constant over time and like the exports do suddenly pick up in Marlborough and out of Nelson Port, then that will boost exports in that area. Or if suddenly GDP in the Marlborough district grows, that's going to boost exports to that region as well. So it takes into account a lot of things.
Yeah.
I think the slide showed that bulk wine would grow a certain amount, of bulk wine would grow on a proportional basis. That decision between that the growth is going to be in bottled more so than bulk. Can you just explain the thinking there is why overseas return to bottled wine?
It's not. It's more potential in terms of looking at. I guess it may well be that overall, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there's probably a lot less trade going on in bulk wine internationally than there is in bottled wine. Now, if that trend changed over the next decade, for whatever reason, I don't know why it would, but if everybody moved more toward bulk wine, it would probably mean that the relative potentials across those two would shift also towards the bulk wine. It's basically looking at existing trade flows as they stand in recent history and going, okay, demand for bottled wine is this large, or trade of bottled wine is this large, trade of bulk wine is this large, therefore all other things being equal, which is not quite true, but all other things being equal, it's probably most of the potential is going to be in what is already a larger market overall internationally. Yes.
Yeah, I can see you're crunching a lot of data already, just in looking at apples to Saudi from a wide range of countries. Are you also looking at the Saudi statistics on the apples that they import?
That's what he was saying.
Yeah.
So that data is based on global trade flows that are collected by UN Comtrade. So every country in the world reports their trade to UN Comtrade. That then gets collated and smoothed out. That's why there's a 10-month delay in updating global trade data. So the demand, remember this is an import demand driven model. So the demand is based on imports into Saudi of those 6 countries. So it's their data reported to UN Comtrade.
Yeah, so I mean, effectively, this number here, apart from the fact New Zealand exports 0.9, this number here has nothing to do with New Zealand's exports currently. It has everything to do with the import demand in Saudi Arabia currently.
And where it comes from.
Yeah. No more questions? Okay, that's fine. I mean, look, feel free to stay around and have a chat, have another drink and some more nibbles. There's plenty left over there and I don't want to eat it all myself. Alice has got some handouts as well, a small handout that you can take away with you. But yeah, more than happy to have a chat and answer any other sort of more detailed or esoteric questions you may have. But yeah, thanks again very much for coming and appreciate you taking the time.